insurmountable task. You'd have the majority of the legislature come together and agree on something. And to give North Florida a break, which is the least underpaid, it has never been done.
So,
I see a lot of people filling out questions.
That's the way to really go.
So
we just continue that, or do you want to take a quick break?
I think we should take a quick break and let people turn in questions, because I've seen a lot of you filling out cards, and I think more of you want to. So if you want to take a moment to do that, and then we're going to collect those questions and take those questions.
And it is flooding, and they're trying to sell it now, and it's flooding when nothing else around there's flooding. I mean, they built it during this drought we had, and many of us, when we saw it built, said that's going to flood, and it is.
So how does something like that happen is actually the question. I mean,
what happens?
Why aren't we permitted out of building a house like that?
You live in Wakulla.
Well, you know, it had to be outside. It had to be outside of 75 feet of the wetlands. That's the county regulation. Now that's different than floodplain, because there is a difference. Even then, you know, we do have FEMA flood maps that show that what your flood elevation is based on the 100-year storm, and you have to build above that base flood elevation. So it was probably something that was more than the 100-year storm event, or.
Yeah.
But could they get a variance to build closer to the wetland? Isn't that kind of what we do? We give variances, we give permits, right?
Well,
So
no,
did we permit them to build closer?
variances are very rare, and they have to be where you have to demonstrate that your property is not buildable without the variance. It's the current regulations. So I don't think it was a wetland issue so much as a floodplain issue, and I don't know what those details are.
It's just interesting to the neighbors, because everybody's wondering how that house was allowed to be built there, when probably the banks don't end up stuck with it, because nobody will buy it. They should.
If I was that person, as soon as FEMA continues the flood maps, I'm willing to bet that house will then be in the floodplain, and they should look into FEMA. And the entire reason, that home, I have no doubt, is not an isolated home, which is why FEMA is stepping in to redo the flood zones here in Wakulla County.
And many neighbors there are saying also could be involved with some filling that was done on low areas too.
Yeah.
If the activity is coming under an individual permit and there are impacted wetlands, any secondary and cumulative, whether it be an isolated or a connected wetland or species, all of that falls under the buffer requirement in that event. Now, if you're proposing development in an upland where there's no wetland impacts, there is no buffer requirement under that.
But the isolated wetland that the state regulates, that you just said came into effect in 2010?
Yes.
Can you build to the edge of that isolated wetland? Or is there a buffer?
Let me ask you, are you impacting any other wetlands as a part of that activity?
Just the isolated wetland.
If you are not impacting any wetlands, you can build out close to it, yes. If you are impacting wetlands because of your impact and because of your construction activity, you have to take into account secondary and cumulative.
I'm confused. If you're impacting the isolated wetland, are you saying the wetland has to be connected to something else?
No.
Okay, so it's an isolated wetland.
There's a primary impact and then there's a secondary and cumulative. If your activity involves a primary impact, then yes, the secondary and cumulative has to be addressed with a buffer and taken into account.
Non-politic,
I can speak to that a little bit. I can speak for Northwest. As a part of our reorg that we did in Northwest, what we did is we blended a lot of our resources where before they used to be separated, where we had a Tallahassee office, we had a Panama City office, and we had a Pensacola office. What we did is we merged our resources from Panama City and Tallahassee. So So instead of just having 2 or 3 processors and wetland inspectors for just Tallahassee office, now we have 8 combined that can, and we all run the circle here for DEP. Then you also have Water Management District that regulates the same territory under their component. So you have 2 different agencies covering the same rule over the same territory. Depending on the activity, depends on whose jurisdiction it falls into. Yes, sir.
As we discussed during the break, would you explain your side on residential property versus water management? Because I think even one of our commissioners who was here was under the assumption that for residential property, it was a Northwest Water Management District that would manage the wetlands, not you folks.
Again, we have an operating agreement between DEP and Water Management District, and it depends on how the activity is coming in and the application is. And I'll give you 2 examples. If an individual homeowner comes to the department or comes to the state and needs a permit for an activity, the individual homeowner is going to fall under the jurisdiction of DEP for Northwest Florida. So we would handle, DEP would be the processor of that permit and the review and the inspection and delineation of the wetlands. We would handle all that at the department. Now, if a developer comes in for an application, and whether it be a 5-acre, 10-acre parcel for a subdivision or a commercial property or something of that nature, then the operation agreement says that the processor will be Water Management District. And that's all outlined in our operation agreement. And we can get a copy of that and provide it.
That changed. I thought it was only the Water Management District if there was only a small.
It really doesn't matter. We're talking minutia here over which agency, the Water Management District or DEP, processes the permit.
Correct.
The rule and the statute that the 2 agencies implement is identical.
It's all the same.
All we're talking about is the administrative processing of the permit.
I just have a different response to the question. Yes, there is no way that with less money and less people that there's any way that we're going to keep up with what's happening. That's a given. And so there's no way that you can regionalize stuff and expect to get better quality care. And I worked at the Northwest Florida Water Management District over a decade ago. And like I mentioned, I grew up canoeing and kayaking this area. And in the year that I worked there, I was an intern when I was in college, there were 4 different people that I found in violation of the Northwest Florida. And what I mean by this, I'm kayaking down a stream and I hear a loud noise. I'm on a spring-fed creek and there's a pipe going right down in the spring in the middle of nowhere, going out to some agricultural property. So I had my GPS and I put it in. I'd go back to work on Monday and find out if that person was permitted. 4 times that I found people that were not permitted. And this is before these budget cuts. We cannot keep up. And this is all of our water coming right out. If you look, I don't think it's going to happen, but people talk about water scarcities in South Florida. They just assessed Orange County. They're dry. Orange County, Orlando cannot get any more water. They're going to be coming up this way. What we have here in North Florida is more precious than gold. We are sitting on one of the cleanest, most pristine aquifers in the entire world. If you look what's happening over in the Middle East, over oil, we can live without oil as a species. Not a single thing can live without water. And here in North Florida, we have to realize what a value this is and that we have to protect it. And we already mentioned the budget cuts across the state, and we already have the wrong end of the stick up here in North Florida to begin with. So it's that much more important for local governments like Wakulla to really take concern of what's happening and to protect our land.
And if I could, I just think it's real important to say that the county still includes wetlands reviews as part of our development review processes, and we have good relationships with the state. So I personally do not think that there will be any wetlands that will be affected without the, what the board is talking about doing is eliminating the buffers. You know, there are arguments for the buffers, and then there are some arguments against the buffers, but I don't believe that there will be wetlands affected by the actions of the state if the county continues their review processes.
Louis, they're getting rid of enforcement and mitigation locally, right?
Well,
Code board would not handle violations anymore.
but the state still will, and
Okay,
I guarantee if we notify the state
But
that
now,
there's wetland
but
being
now
filled,
your
they will
office
take
handles
action.
mitigation, and the code board would handle the violations. That's going away under what you're proposing.
No, the wetlands impacts, I think, are not going, the review of the wetlands impacts are not going away, and we still have the ability to notify the state and ensure that permits are required. And we cannot issue a development permit if they don't have state permits for wetlands. So I don't see where we're not going to keep doing that.
Okay, we got this right in the back there.
All right. First of all, let's put it this way. I have watched this whole wetland thing going for the last 40-some years. And I can remember two wonderful things I saw. One was in 1973 when, on Fiddler's Point, we shut down developers with bulldozers that were pushing spoil piles into a creek and blocking the creek and the navigable waters. And we were able to get through the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund to call the Marine Patrol to go out there and go cease and desist to the developer and to the bulldozer operators. They were going to arrest them when they should have, in fact, arrested the owners, but they couldn't do that. Anyway, it was a great, magnificent scene of which I'm writing a book on right now and hope to have that out in a few months, and that has that scene in there. The other was not just a few years ago with Ronald Fred Crum destroying a freshwater marshland. A beautiful marshland that was full of lily pads, frogs, and everything else. Half of that wetland was on the refuge property, and the refuge is a bunch of wimps and cowards and will not stand up to private property and will let their land be destroyed, as was happening over there. It's a very sad thing, but it's really true. The refuge has no guts and no proprietary rights. Okay, the other beautiful thing was a beautiful, gorgeous red stop work order that our Code Enforcement Board placed on that property. Now, they got sued for it, I think, and it was questionable whether it was legal or not. The fact is, I have watched habitats, marshes, seagrass beds throughout this whole panhandle, and we're talking about the pipe of the water, destroyed. You call DEP, and now, well, we can't get to it. We're just so understaffed, we're so underworked, and so on and so forth. 2 or 3 or 4 days later, while the bulldozer is crushing under marsh grass and things that have taken 10,000 years to grow since the last great melt of the Ice Age, permanently destroying it, it has to go through its bureaucracy, and then they come out, and then eventually they'll say cease and desist. A good part of the time, the developers just laugh at them and just go right on, and then they get at best a little wrist slap. I've been in court battles where, oh, this land is priceless. Yeah, it's priceless, but we can't put a price on it. No problem. A little bit of mitigation. Mitigation now and then works. Now and then mitigation is garbage. Doesn't do anything. The fact is that if I want to fill a wetland today, I will get my big trusty bulldozer and I will start filling it, and there's not a damn thing anybody can do. As I understand, Louis, the biggest fine for wetland destruction with the county ordinance was like $100 or $150. That's all that's gotten. So after all this stuff that is going to impact shrimp and fish and crabs and wildlife, ecotourism, everything else like that, water quality, our clean beaches, because these isolated wetlands, as well as the other ones, serve as major filters for bacteria and for other things and help hold it back. $100 fine. And then we have the audacity of these county commissioners, 4 developer-related people, to sit there and go against the public will, the public health, the public good, the public everything, and sit there and say, in the name of private property, shove this on through. I think it's reprehensible. Not only that, it's going to make Wakulla County the biggest laughing stock in the country, because by the time this thing blows up and goes national and international, we're going to talk about this little county that has a treasurer that says, on one hand, ecotourism, come on down. We have this wonderful habitat. P.S. We want to stop wetland protection at the same time. You know? It's also going to say, we don't value our wetlands near enough to enforce them and to charge real fines and to make it problematic. Believe me, if the damage that these people did, I'll get there anyway. One guy with a gun or walking into a junior food store and stealing some stuff like that will bring down the gendarmes and the police and the whole thing and screaming sirens. Developer doing far more damage, far more public harm, and everything else like that is completely ignored. So when we start talking about this regulation, that regulation, so on and so forth, this group of Northwest Management, let's realistically say, what are we doing? And the answer is nothing, almost nothing.
Does anybody wish to respond to that?
Right on.
Refuge, you can try to calculate how much they get for entrance fees, canoeing, boat ramps and stuff.
I can only speculate. Right after high school, I worked in a national park out west, and I had a little tag that said Tabitha, Florida, and I had a woman come up to me and said, "Oh, I just left Florida." And I'm like, "Where'd you go?" And she's like, "You've never heard of it. You've never heard of it." My husband and I like to go to kind of off-the-wall type places, and I'm like, "Where?" And she's like, Wakulla Springs. We went down, and they were there for a whole month, and this was back in '95. And so, and I know that you all have are building a new environmental learning institute. The whole reason why this county was chosen, not only is proximity to TCC and other learning institutions, because of what it looks like, because it's attractiveness. You're right, this is a place that, you know, when you show up, it's going to look like it's a place that an environmental institute learns, and this is a place where people are going to be taught how to do ecotourism. The state of Florida thought that Wakulla County was the primary place to have this type of education. And so I agree with Jack Rudlow in the aspect that it does send kind of mixed messages.
Okay. We got to keep
Yeah,
moving.
this is like, if the panel could, stick with that question on economics, because that slide up over there says, understanding the economics and ecology of the wetlands. We've spoken very little on it, so if they could just address that issue.
Wakulla Springs is $20 million a year, over 200,000 visitors. And if that ends up like Wakaiba, where it's just all hydro with no water in it, imagine what impact that would have on the local economy.
There are a number of prepared questions that address the regulatory programs. I'll try to whip through them fairly quickly. Yes, the ERP program regulates dredging and filling in wetlands. It covered contiguous wetlands going back into the 80s and isolated wetlands.
Jim, they don't have the
Northwest
questions,
Florida.
by the way. You need to read the questions.
I just did. And in Northwest Florida, picked up isolated wetlands in 2010. So the answer is, do the state regulatory programs include and address dredging and filling activities in isolated wetlands? The answer is today, yes, they do. I will note, though, there's been some misinformation out there with respect to the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers got kicked out of isolated wetlands in a U.S. Supreme Court decision a number of years ago. And more recently, another U.S. Supreme Court decision has made it very, very unclear whether the Corps of Engineers has any jurisdiction over adjacent wetlands, that's wetlands adjacent to rivers, or, even worse, headwater streams. So how far up the Sotchapi River, for example, Corps of Engineers jurisdiction goes is very unclear. Is it true that the state regulatory programs identify that activities in wetlands and other surface waters must not be contrary to the public interest, or if the activity is located in an outstanding Florida water, the activity must be clearly in the public interest? Basically, the answer is yes, although with respect to OFW, if an activity is going to significantly degrade, even if it's not within an OFW, it has to be clearly in the public interest. Are there special provisions that protect waters used for shellfish harvesting? Yes, but only in those waters, not necessarily in adjacent uplands. And that's waters approved, Class 2 waters approved for shellfish harvesting. Question about the current wetlands, Wakulla Wetlands ordinance was adopted in August 2010. At that time, did the state regulated isolated wetlands in Wakulla County? No. They got that in November of 2010. Does DEP provide wetlands delineation? How about the county? Since about '94, there has been a single statewide rule on wetland delineation that's used by all levels of government in the state of Florida, not including the Corps of Engineers because they're not state of Florida. The county can do wetlands delineation using that rule. Consultants can do it. DEP can do it. The Water Management District can do it, as long as they use the rule.
The county requires that if we feel like there is a wetland on the property, that you have a biologist delineate those wetlands.
Which is, speaking from DEP's perspective, that's a good thing. There's some counties that kick it back to DEP to do a binding wetland delineation, which is not a good thing because we're short-staffed. Having a qualified biologist or somebody else do the delineation.
But that requirement from the counties being eliminated, isn't it, Louis? That preliminary letter, et cetera, all comes under the ordinance.
Well, the way I understand it, there's not been, the direction from the board is to eliminate the buffers, the 75-foot buffer around.
It's to eliminate the ordinance.
Well, the way I understand it is, that's not the direction, and that's not my understanding. You know, there is still going to be a wetlands ordinance, as I understand it. We are going to have to revise it based on the direction of the board to get rid of the buffers. You know, and I may be wrong on that, and I will seek clarification.
You are wrong on that.
You are.
Howard telling? The board is trying to do away with the wetland ordinance entirely.
Mm-hmm.
That is what they're going to.
There was some discussion that we need to follow the state regulations. The only additional protection I think without the buffers that the ordinance would provide is that as a part of our review process we would require the wetland delineation. So you're right. You may be right. I will seek clarification on that.
I am.
Well, I mean, they voted on it. What did they vote on?
Louis, the state would require the delineation as well, right?
It will.
So the delineation will still be made either way, correct?
It will, but we cannot require it as a part of our review process.
Understanding what you said earlier, you would already require them to show up with a state permit with the delineation before we move forward.
Well, that's a good distinction, but as a part of, like, if somebody came in for a subdivision, we could not require a permit at that point. It's really before they start developing, before they turn dirt.
But the state, if it's a subdivision that's going to impact wetlands, will have a permit.
They will have a permit at that point.
Which will require delineations.
That's right. Now, we would like it at the beginning stages because that's just good planning, because you don't want to get to the point where you're developing and, oh, hey, there's a wetland here, we're going to have to redo lots.
Absolutely, the best interest would to do it front. I think that's what the state requests anyway themselves.
And almost every developer that we come across already has a permit before they come see us.
Well, they want to know if they can move forward.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Do you want to say something?
I do. I was going to add to concur with that the state would require, if there were wetland impacts, we would require the delineation, we would require all that process that we have to work through that. Now, I will say for homeowners, upon request, you can ask us to come out there and do that delineation for you on your property, and we will do that for you as an individual homeowner. Our staff will come out there and do that. Our turnaround has typically been within a week to 2 weeks, if from start to finish, from needing it done. I'll say that what we typically run into from an issue is it's not always clear what is a wetland and what is not. It's not as clear as you would think it's just a pristine swamp. There are lots of areas that are actually wet, they just don't look wet, and that's why we always provide that resource, and we'll be happy to do it upon request for individual homeowners, just so that you know. Sometimes that's a little misunderstood.
Yeah, I just, to kind of put things in perspective, with Wakulla County getting ready, deciding maybe to get rid of this buffer zone, I'm upland in Leon County, and I'm sure a lot of you have been aware that Wakulla Springs was required to do a federal assessment. The state of Florida never followed the Clean Water Act that was passed in 1972. We dragged our feet on it, so we were actually sued by environmental groups and went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Florida lost. So we're required by the federal government to assess every single one of our water bodies, and that's been going on for the last 40 years. Wakulla County's assessment of Wakulla Springs just got done this past January. There have been meetings almost every month right here at this library talking about regional meetings, what we're going to do to help clean up Wakulla County. It's the BMAP meetings. Now, I'm up in Leon County. I'm a soil and water conservation supervisor. It has been determined that a certain amount of pollutants are coming from Leon County. We're upland. They're coming down here. I personally am planning on pushing for getting the rest of our county off septic, and it is a possibility. It's millions of dollars. It would create grants. It will make it that much more difficult for my county and city commission to even consider it. If Wakulla County itself isn't doing enough to protect our wetlands, how can I expect my county to help the water bodies down here? So something that you need to keep in mind when you're deciding whether to get rid of this or not. It is going to affect the region.
Okay.
We still have a wetlands ordinance. Now, assuming the board wants us to get rid of the ordinance, the county cannot, but the state still can. And I think what Mr. Russell was getting at is the state still enforces wetland regulations, and will still be working with the state to inform them when developments come in of state impacts, just like we do with DOT whenever there's a development on a state roadway. We work with DOT as a part of our development review process. We would continue to do that as a part of the site plan and subdivision review process.
Ready for the next one?
Yes?
No, wait. It didn't make sense. You said earlier that the board directed you to get rid of language in the comp plan.
Yes.
So if there's no language in the comp plan, how does that affect the ordinance, the wetlands ordinance? There's no teeth to the ordinance then.
There's no There's no buffer requirements. You're right. The buffer requirements are in the comp plan, and the board is clearly doing away with the wetland buffer requirements.
So the ordinance is kind of just flat because there's no way to enforce the ordinance then because there's no language in the comp plan.
Other than the part where it's part of our development review process. Yeah, you're right.
The ordinance is still on the books regardless of the comp plan.
Well, we'll have to amend the ordinance. I'm sure the board.
Assuming that the board removes the setback from the comp plan, one would assume
yes,
that they're at least going to take that out of the ordinance.
And isolated wetlands.
Absolutely. Well, and isolated wetlands will be covered by the state.
No buffer.
But no buffers, you're right. Absolutely.
Before we move on, let me make one other quick comment. A lot of the discussion is focused on buffers. There are other things in the county ordinance, for example, dock construction criteria, that are not, quite candidly, in state regulation. Single-family docks are exempt from state regulation as long as they meet certain very limited criteria. The county dock construction criteria are much more stringent than the state. If that disappears, then those construction standards would no longer be enforced in Wakulla County.
You are correct. There are regulations in the wetland ordinance on docks and boardwalks and things like that. So yeah, we would have to get direction on that, but primarily we're concerned with the buffer requirements. That's really what we're dealing with right now.
You know, maybe it's a good time to distinguish the karst protection because that's where your docks and your piers and boat ramps come in.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that will still stay in.
And that's actually one of the questions that we had, so it's good. We do have separate protections for karst features, separate protections for springs. There are additional setbacks of up to 150 feet for those. So even without the wetland buffers, we still have protection for karst features and springs. There's still a 50-foot water body buffer that's on the books as well that will remain. But again, it is doing away with the 75-foot wetland buffer.
I'll speak to it on this side. I would like to confirm the duplex, triplex, quadruplex component to that for accuracy. Okay. I'll say this, we don't regulate upland activity in that regard. So if there's no wetland impacts associated, it's not regulated. I mean, there would be no buffer. It's like building a road. I mean, it's an upland.
To be candid, that's been in
That's been in
rule
play for a while.
decades.
Right. That's not new. That's just a carryover from current rule.
You can argue about its wisdom, but if it's single-family home construction, only in uplands, it's been exempt from ERP permitting since the mid-90s.
Yes.
For the state.
And probably exempt from the stormwater regulation in the water management district prior to then outside of Northwest.
Yes, please.
I need to ask a point of clarification.
Please.
From what I understand, there's an ordinance in place that the current county commission wants to do away with the buffer protection. My question to understand, we have at least one member of the county commission here. Why? Who benefits? Why would you want to do away with something that is so simply rationally right? Who is going to benefit?
I don't think the commissioners
If we have two commissioners here?
Yes.
I don't understand.
Yes, they can.
Can you?
Yes, they can. Under public record.
Hey, I want to fight.
Yes, they can. Under sunshine law. Of course they can.
As someone that holds elected office,
You're not
if
making
there's an
a
elected
decision.
official that refuses to answer a question of a citizen, they do not deserve to hold the office.
Right.
They were elected.
Refusing to
It's a publicly noticed forum, and two people happen to be here. Sunshine law allows you to answer questions.
I'm sorry, everybody. Rachel, what were you just saying?
I was saying, and I know there's people who know sunshine better, even better than me in this room.
I teach it.
Dana teaches it, so it's been publicly noticed, and it's a public forum. You can answer a question. It's not private
Or you can
communication.
refuse.
But there's repercussions for that. But there's no.
Rachel, did you say it was publicly noticed?
It's publicly noticed. It's publicly noticed.
Go ahead, County.
It was publicly noticed to the county. It appeared in the Wakulla News.
Ask Howard to walk outside and I'll talk until you guys get tired of hearing me talk.
Okay. Exactly. Howard's really good. Okay.
Howard's on his way.
Trust me, I'm not scared. Bye, Howard.
All right.
I'm not demonstrated that by now.
We do not want to get the county commission in trouble.
Why don't you let her ask the question again?
Absolutely. Yes, please ask your question again.